Let's talk gunships, man. So you get assigned to gunships, not something normal for guys in your job at the time. Can you kind of break us down different types of gunships, the different roles on the gunships, and then we can get into specifically you were on the whiskey, correct?
Yeah. So at AFSOC at the time, at Hobart Field, there were AC-130Us with the U-boats, which are
Okay.
like arguably the most famous gunships. Right? They've been around since Nam. They're in Call of Duty, like all that stuff. You see in the movies. When someone says a gunship in the movie, that's what they're talking about. So that's what I trained on. Actually, was AC-130Us. That's what I got qualified on, and I didn't. I wound up like cross training to the whiskeys in Afghanistan, but sticking to the U-boat, right? So it's a C-130. All C-130s are just cargo planes. That's what they were designed for. Sometime in Nam, some like mad geniuses had this idea: what if we put a howitzer on a plane? And they did that. They took a 105 millimeter howitzer and they stuck it in the side of a C-130, and they said, "All right, let's make this work." And then they did, and guns that big, they can only fire so fast, right? So like whatever the number of rounds per minute is, it's not that many for a 105. So then they said, okay, what do we put some smaller guns on there? And then they over time they stuck a 40 mil Bushmaster and a 25 millimeter Gatling gun on there. So you've got the three side by side sticking at the side of the plane, howitzer, 40 mil and 25. That takes a lot of people, right? So a gunship crew is like 13, 14 people, depending on whether DSO is there. So, pilot, co-pilot, navigator, flight engineer. You got the sensor operators. So big thing about a gunship, you get the guns, you can shoot people, but like, how do you find those people? So you've got the sensor operators. And then you've got a fire control officer. So they're responsible for sort of aiming the guns, managing the guns. You've got an electronic warfare officer. So that's a historic thing. Like that was really important in Nam, right? Like planes got shot down all the time. And you would want to track sort of incoming surface to air missiles, that sort of thing. And then you've got the gunners in the back, and the gunners like physically load the guns, right? Like the Gatling maybe, right? It's belt fed. It kind of doesn't need a lot, but the 105, you have to physically like load, reload, remove shells, all that kind of stuff. And then you have a loadmaster who has to balance the plane because putting all the bullets on a plane makes it pretty weird. And so they're responsible for that. And then you have so DSO, direct support operator, linguist is not like required for a gunship to fly at
Mm-hmm.
all. Everybody else I talked about, like you have to have those people. You can't fly without a flight engineer. You can't fly without a navigator. But you can fly without a DSO for sure. And plenty of people would prefer to fly without a DSO. But when a DSO flies, you're sitting. There's on a gunship. You can find videos of this online. It's called the booth, and that's where sort of all the people, basically the pilot co-pilots are up front, and then the gunners are in the back, and then everybody else is sort of in the middle in this box that you're sitting in with all the various technology that exists.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did some training with them down here one time, and they landed over Miramar and let us do a walk around. They're really
Oh,
interesting. Yeah, they're really interesting aircraft. To just even be inside, it's like wow, this is the way it's all set up and everything. It's like this is just I don't know, not normal. Obviously, the closest
no.
thing the
Yeah.
closest thing that we have in the Marine Corps was when they started using the Harvest Hawks, where they took the C-130, put the Griffin missile on it, and put Hellfire missile on it. Um, and those were really, we loved having those on station too. So that was the good thing. And we'll talk about this more because your aircraft was a daytime flying one. That was the thing we liked about having the Harvest Hawk is because you couldn't get any kind of C-130 support during the daytime, the AC-130 support during the daytime. So a Harvest Hawk could come on station and sit there and do scans for you and stuff for like 3 hours, and then and employ ordnance if necessary and stuff. It's not as cool as flying low and shooting the gun and stuff like that, but it's like in my experience, most of the stuff that happened was during the daytime anyway, so it was more logical for them to be up and providing close air support during that timeline. Um, so let's talk about your role specifically on the aircraft. What are you bringing to the mission? Why are they bringing you on board? You said some people may not want you guys there. Why is that?
Yeah, so the job of a DSO is provide threat warning. That's like to the aircraft and to ground personnel. So I always say, and I still say to this day, that basically I worked for you guys. I worked for a JTEC, right? I'm there, to protect the plane, but in the time that I was in Afghanistan, there weren't, real threats for the most part. Like gunships are still not going to fly during the day because big, easy target, fat,
Mm-hmm.
slow. No. And a gunship got shot down in Iraq for that exact reason of flying during the day, so they stopped doing that. But for the most part, my job is to provide threat warning to people on the ground. So, you can, you're just listening to push to talk radios, like that's what the Taliban are using. So big fancy walkie-talkies, more or less, big battery-powered walkie-talkies, not dissimilar to a lot of JTAC radios, I think.
Yeah.
Just not as good, but not dissimilar.
Not encrypted, obviously.
Yeah, right. And so, yeah, you listen to them and, they talk about all sorts of stuff. The reason maybe some people, right, there was a running joke that like a DSO is not worth their weight in bullets. And it's because pretty much every other job on the plane, you can see what they're doing. Right? So a gunner, like, physically puts a bullet in a gun. Like, that's really important. The sensors, they're operating their cameras. They're what you're talking about. Like, you have to find the guys who are shooting at you or planning, nefarious stuff. You can see what a sensor's doing. FOCO-map, pilot, everybody, same thing. Like, you really understand what they're doing. You look at a DSO and it's just like a nerdy person with headphones on. Like, that's what you see, and it's you can't explain it because you're like, well, yeah, let me explain 2 years of training to you, and then like maybe we'll have a conversation. It's not worth it. And the other thing is that a lot of the time we are not providing like actionable, information because a lot of the time there just isn't any. Right? There's not always firefights. There's not always like bad guys plotting, and so you could have whole missions where to the rest of the gunship they're like, why were you here? And what did you do? Do anything? Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. In 2011, we had a guy. I was the fires chief, and one day I was with 3.6 at the time, and one day we had the one of the nets, one of the radio frequencies that we were listening to was a single channel radio frequency that we were using, and it was encrypted on our end and stuff like that. And I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden I started hearing, Dari or Pashto or something coming over, and I'm like, what the hell? This is on our net. Like, what the heck is this? And then it stopped for a couple minutes and it came back, and I'm like, hey, what is this? And they brought in some dude I had never seen before on this little fob, and he's some nerd dude come walking in and sat down and put the headset to his ear and started writing it out, and writing it out in that Arabic, like however you describe that kind of writing. And I was just like, who are you, dude? Like, where have you been? And it's just some guy locked away somewhere in a closet just listening to radios all day. I was like, man, that's a crazy job. And then I never saw him again after that. It was pretty interesting.
Yeah, so they're ground linguists, and that's what they would do. I mean, I have friends from language school. That's what they did. They go work somewhere, and they work like 10-hour shifts. Yeah, that's all they do is they sit there and listen and they type out. Yeah.
What is that like, man? I mean, just to listen to. I mean, obviously the weird voyeurism of it, right? Of just listening to conversations. Like you said, there's not gunfights going on all the time. So a lot of these conversations are probably just mundane, general conversations. What did you think about that? Just hearing such like personal talk from people.
It was a developing thought process, that's for sure. It's it's very strange. Like at first, because at least in the role I was in, right, that my job is to provide threat warning. Like that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And the thing that maybe people told me and I just didn't listen because I was young and stupid, or maybe they told me and I couldn't understand it, is that like the necessary part of doing the job of providing threat warning is listening to all of the mundane stuff, because you can have mundane until it's not, right? Like everything's good until shit hits the fan, and you have to, you don't know when that peak is going to happen, so you do have to listen to all this stuff. And it's very strange because it is I'd be hard pressed to imagine that somebody could do that and not be like, oh, I'm just like listening to people. Because before, if I describe it to maybe even to you or other people who did your job, it's like, no, you're like listening to the Taliban. Like, and that's this whole idea, right? They shot at you and like bad stuff was happening, and yeah, they're the bad guys. They're absolutely the bad guys. But also when you're listening to them and you're hearing all this like normal conversations, like, oh, but they're people too. And maybe, to people who are smarter than me, that's like, well, duh. But to 22-year-old me who had like trained to do this very specific job, it was not a sort of duh thing. It was like, oh wow, this is a very different thing.
When you were in training, I imagine they have some kind of audio tapes or something for you to listen to as like training guides or something, or training aids or something like that. Do they include? Is it all just military stuff that they introduce you to, or do they include a lot of just general conversation?
So like in language school, right, that's what you're learning is there are some, obligatory military lessons. I think this also changes depending on the language you're in. Mm-hmm. So I think that like Russian language school, there's probably a lot of really complicated military stuff, right? Because they have a huge military industrial complex. Afghanistan, not so much. So, 95% of my training is like normal stuff. A lot of it becomes the news and like reading like economic papers about economics and stuff like this, because you have to get really good at the language, mm-hmm. even though you're listening to like really basic stuff. You do listen to military stuff. The things that you're talking about like get really classified, and so that training is there's not as much of it. There just like can't be, right? Because you can only listen to it in certain buildings at certain hours of the day with certain people around and like that sort of stuff. And at least for what I did, there was also just less of that, because you can imagine if we think about Russia, right? You can record how many thousands of hours of like Russian material, like Russian, big communication networks do people record? Probably quite a lot. Versus like if you're recording the Taliban, you're only going to record like when they're fighting, right? Like why would you record dudes asking other dudes about, how's the weather?
Yeah.
So and it's expected that you already know that. Like the fighting stuff, maybe it's not expected because that's a different type of talking. The way you talked on a radio in the middle of a firefight is like not English to other people, right? If you just took a random civilian and said, "Hey, tell me what this guy's talking about," they'd be like, "I don't know." And so that stuff, like you do have to learn about that. But why would anybody be like, "Oh yeah, also, hey, remember they're gonna ask about like how's their cousin, how's the weather, how's the road, that sort of thing."
Yeah. I mean, if you listening to conversations all the time, these normal conversations, are they similar to the conversations you would hear if you sat down in the chow hall next to a couple guys that were just BSing, and you overheard that? Is it kind of the same vibe, or are they having conversations that you would never even consider?
I don't think conversations I would never consider, because I'm not, it's dudes talking over push to talks. I'm not listening to like phone calls or anything, right? So
For
I'm
sure.
not listening to, hugely. I'm never going to hear like
full in depth.
Call somebody to like wax philosophic about something. Like you probably call a buddy because something bad happened in your life, and I'm like, I need to talk about. I'm not going to hear any of that. I didn't.
Okay.
But dick jokes for sure, right? Like dudes are planning an attack and they're making dick jokes. Absolutely. Whining, complaining, right? Like I imagine you spent many a cold night in Afghanistan. Well, so did they, and so they would talk about it. Like, what else are you gonna do? You're bored and freezing your ass off. Like, of course you're gonna talk about it.
Mm-hmm. We had our Afghan linguist with us, and he carried a monitor where we would listen, or he carried a radio where we would listen to some of the transmissions back and forth. And it would be crazy because we'd be in like a firefight sometimes, and he'd be talking shit to him, like in the middle of the firefight. And they'd be like, "We're gonna cut your head off," and he's like, "We're gonna fucking kill you," like just this weird back and forth. And we're like, "Dude, stop! Like, what are you doing?" Like, that's not helping the situation, probably.
Yeah, that's crazy that he he talked back to them. Oh wow.
Yeah, because it was just a regular radio. It was like one of their radios, and he just had it to listen to. And he would tell us like, I remember one thing that I passed back to. It was like, they're not afraid of like fixed wing aircraft. They're like, oh, I had a Harrier coming in to do a simulated gun run and then do a show of force kind of pass because we couldn't get clearance to drop. And the commander on the radio was like, just hide in the trees. They're not actually going to drop. Like they knew we weren't actually going to drop any ordnance. And I was like, man, these fucking guys, it's like,
no, man, it's weird. They're real savvy.
Yeah. That's what I always told people. I'm like, don't, you gotta respect what they're doing with what they have. Part of it is through brute force. One thing a lot of people don't realize is a lot of these local Afghans don't care about the Taliban either. When the Taliban shows up, we would hear about fights between the local Taliban guys and the international Taliban guys, the guys that would come down from Pakistan, because they're coming down and like, why are you guys messing stuff up? You know, you have to give us a house to live in and give us food to eat while we're here. They're like, dude, we're out here fighting every day and singing. Like, what are you know, you're coming down from the good life. It's such a weird dynamic when you start hearing those other conversations, and you got to hear that all the time, which is crazy. Tell us more about it, man. I mean, in the book, your first mission out was a crazy ass firefight, and it sounds like you were just inundated, kind of sensory overload from everything that you were hearing.